Welcome to the Maybe Not So Great Books channel, You Decide. This is lesson 3 of 14, the 4 generational archetypes, science or horoscope, from the 4th turning, generational theory across 3 decades by Neil Howe and William Strauss.
Hi, everyone. I'm really looking forward to getting into this one today.
You are a prophet, a nomad, a hero, or an artist, and your birth year decided which. At least, that's what 2 Washington consultants told 70 million Americans. The National Academies of Sciences said they were wrong. Who do you believe?
Yeah, that really is the central question we're tackling, isn't it? It's a massive contradiction.
It totally is. And welcome everyone to this custom-tailored deep dive. We are genuinely thrilled that you're joining us for this because, well, we are targeting one of the most culturally pervasive, incredibly successful, and intensely debated frameworks of the last half century.
Right, the Strauss and Howe framework. It's everywhere.
Exactly. Our mission today is straightforward, but absolutely massive in scope. We are taking your source material, specifically the generational theory framework, across their trilogy of books, which spans 32 years of publishing, and we are extracting the core insights about their famous 4-archetype taxonomy.
And if you've ever caught yourself wondering why we, as a society, just obsessively use labels like boomer or millennial or Gen Z, this is exactly where that modern obsession was manufactured.
Yes. We are going to deconstruct the architecture of the stereotypes that you already know so well.
It's a profound pleasure to be unpacking this with you today. To set the stage for our analysis, we are going to maintain a calm, highly analytical, and forensic approach to this material. The reason being, today we are looking at what is arguably the most commercially successful yet scientifically indefensible element of cyclical history ever produced for mass consumption.
It's basically a blockbuster movie script posing as sociology.
That's a great way to put it. We are going to examine how a grand, sweeping historical theory transitioned from a descriptive catalog of the past into a highly lucrative corporate product. And crucially, we will explore the fascinating, almost unbelievable gap between its massive popularity in boardrooms and the overwhelming outright rejection it has faced from the actual scientific, academic, and demographic communities.
Because you already know the memes, right?
Yeah.
You know the joke that boomers are out of touch, or that millennials are killing the napkin industry while eating avocado toast.
Oh, the avocado toast. I mean, we couldn't get through this without mentioning that.
Right. Or that Gen Z communicates entirely in indecipherable TikTok dances. But what you might not know is the highly structured, almost clockwork scaffolding behind those cultural jokes.
And the contrast between who uses this framework and who rejects it is just staggering. You have a framework that is currently utilized by Fortune 500 HR departments, elite marketing agencies, and even the United States military to manage vast populations of people.
The military? I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, it is. And yet, actual credentialed demographers view this framework as having the exact same scientific validity as reading your daily horoscope in the newspaper.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the scientific community didn't just quietly disagree in the dusty pages of obscure academic journals. They actively, publicly revolted. And this is a story that I don't think gets told enough.
Yeah, the 2021 open letter.
Exactly. In 2021, an open letter was drafted by Philip N. Cohen, a highly respected sociologist and demographer at the University of Maryland. But it wasn't just Cohen. This letter was signed by approximately 150 demographers and social scientists.
Which is a huge consensus in that field.
It's practically everyone. And they didn't just issue a polite critique of the methodology. They directly demanded that the Pew Research Center stop using these generational labels entirely. Now, for you listening, you need to understand why they targeted Pew.
Pew is the gold standard.
Right. The Pew Research Center is essentially the absolute benchmark for public polling and demographic data. When journalists want to know what America is thinking, they quote Pew.
Precisely. And Pew's endorsement of these categories legitimized them for the entire media ecosystem. Cohen and those 150 scientists argued that using these arbitrary cutoff dates, like saying anyone born between 1981 and 1996 is fundamentally different from someone born in 1997, it forces researchers to see rigid differences that simply do not exist in the actual data.
It creates a false boundary.
Exactly. To really grasp what the demographers were arguing, we need to understand a foundational concept in sociology.
Right.
The difference between a cohort effect, a period effect, and a life stage or age effect. This is critical to the whole debate.
I am so glad you brought that up because this is the absolute key to unlocking why the scientists are so frustrated. Let me break this down for you, the listener, because it's a mental model that will completely change how you read the news. Imagine a headline that says, "Millennials are killing the housing market because they refuse to buy homes."
We've all seen that exact headline dozens of times.
Yeah, right. Now, the generational theory, the cohort effect, claims that millennials possess a unique shared psychological trait, perhaps a preference for urban renting or a rejection of suburban values, specifically because of the generation they belong to.
Right, that is the cohort effect explanation. They do something because they are millennials.
Yeah.
But demographers argue that what we are actually seeing is a mix of period effects and life stage effects.
So what is a period effect exactly? Let's make sure that's super clear.
A period effect is a massive event that impacts everyone in society at the exact same time, regardless of their age. Think about the 2008 Great Recession, the COVID-19 pandemic, the invention of the smartphone. These are period effects. They change the behavior of 20-year-olds and 60-year-olds simultaneously.
Okay, that makes total sense. And then you have the life stage effect, or the age effect. This is just the simple reality of human biology and economic progression. Being 24 years old, fresh out of college, carrying student debt, and trying to secure an entry-level job in a tough economy that is a life stage, it makes you risk-averse, it makes you delay buying a house, and it makes you delay having children.
And the demographers in that open letter were essentially screaming at the media. Stop confusing being young and broke with a fixed generational personality trait.
Yes.
Strauss and Howe consistently take life stage realities and brand them as permanent cohort characteristics. It's a massive analytical failure.
And the most surprising result of that 2021 open letter, Pew actually listened to the scientists.
They really did, which was a huge shift.
In 2023, the Pew Research Center made a massive pivot. They largely abandoned generational framing in their reporting. They publicly acknowledged that these labels are arbitrary and have no scientific basis.
They realized that grouping millions of incredibly diverse people into these rigid 15 to 20-year buckets was creating a fundamentally distorted picture of social reality. It was a watershed moment in modern sociology. It represented a formal institutional rejection of the very categories that Strauss and Howe had spent 30 years popularizing.
Which brings us entirely back to you, the listener. Think about your own life. Have you ever felt boxed in by being called a millennial, a Gen Xer, or a boomer? Have you ever sat in a meeting and felt like your perspective was being dismissed or categorized simply because of the year stamped on your birth certificate?
I think we all have at some point. It's incredibly reductive.
It is. So today we're going to explore exactly who invented that specific box you've been put in, how they meticulously built it, and why the scientific community wants to tear it down completely. Let's dive into the core concept of this theory. How does this massive 80-year clockwork mechanism actually operate?
Well, to truly understand the Strauss and Howe framework, you cannot just look at the individual generations. You have to understand the master clock that drives them, which the authors call the saeculum.
Saeculum. It sounds very ancient.
It is. It's a fascinating concept derived from ancient Etruscan and Roman usage. Originally, it referred to the length of a long human life, or the time from the foundation of a city until the longest living person born on that exact day finally dies. In historical terms, it spans approximately 80 to 100 years. According to Strauss and Howe, Anglo-American history has moved in these incredibly predictable, recurring secular cycles since the late 15th century.
It is such a grand, sweeping view of history.
Yeah.
They are essentially saying that human events are not linear and they are not random. They're deeply cyclical.
Right. And within each 80 to 100-year saeculum, history moves through 4 distinct turnings, each lasting roughly 20 to 25 years. These turnings are explicitly analogous to the seasons of the year.
Okay, so walk us through the seasons.
You have a high, which is spring. You have an awakening, which is summer. You have an unraveling, which is autumn. And you have a crisis, which is winter.
So spring, summer, fall, winter. High, awakening, unraveling, crisis. To ground this in history, let's look at the most recent completed saeculum, which culminated in the crisis of World War II. After the Allied victory, America entered a high spring period. This was the late 1940s and 1950s. Institutions were incredibly strong, public consensus was high, but individualism was stifled.
Exactly. Then came the awakening this summer. This was the consciousness revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. Institutions were attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy.
Following that was the unraveling the autumn. This was the 1980s and 1990s, the era of the culture wars, where individualism peaked but public trust decayed.
And finally, the cycle demands a crisis, the winter. The authors argue we are currently in this winter phase, a period of massive institutional destruction and eventual rebuilding.
And here is a great way to conceptualize this for you listening. I want you to imagine that history itself is a monolithic casting director for a grand stage play. The exact year you are born dictates the season of history you are going to grow up in. And because that specific season shapes your formative childhood years, the casting director hands you an unchangeable script, a highly specific archetype that you will be forced to play for your entire life.
It's a very rigid script.
It is. Strauss and Howe claim that every single generation falls into a fixed, endlessly repeating four-type sequence based entirely on their birth placement in this cycle. Let's break down these four roles, because this taxonomy is the absolute beating heart of their theory. First up, we have the prophets, which they originally called the idealists in their 1991 book, Generations.
The prophet archetype is born after a crisis, during a high, and they come of age during a spiritual awakening. The quintessential modern example of the prophet archetype is the baby boomer generation.
So, born in the spring, coming of age in the summer.
Right. Now, let's trace the logic of the theory here. Because boomers are born in a post-crisis period, the 1950s, which is defined by strong institutional consensus, rigid conformity, and a focus on collective building, they grow up feeling profoundly stifled.
The culture feels suffocating to them.
Exactly. So as they come of age in the 1960s, they rebel. They attack the very institutions built by their parents. They turn inward, focusing heavily on inner life, morals, values, and spiritual exploration.
They are the generation of Woodstock, of the anti-war movement, of tearing down the rigid societal norms of the 1950s. But the theory tracks them through their entire life cycle, doesn't it?
It does. As prophets age into midlife and eventually elderhood, that youthful rebellion calcifies into something else. They become increasingly righteous, uncompromising, and absolutist in their moral visions.
There's a deeply revealing quote from the source material, specifically from the fourth turning, that captures this perfectly. The authors write, "Every prophet generation enters elderhood convinced that it alone have the vision needed to save the world."
It is a striking assertion, particularly when you look at the historical parallels the authors draw. They compare the baby boomers to previous prophet generations, most notably the missionary generation.
Who were they?
That was the cohort born right after the Civil War, who eventually became the uncompromising elders pushing for prohibition and moral purity in the 1910s and 20s. They also trace this archetype all the way back to the Puritans. The theory insists that this psychological trajectory from youthful spiritual rebel to uncompromising moralistic elder is a fixed historical mechanism.
And that self-portrait is fascinating, especially considering that Neil Howe and William Strauss are both baby boomers themselves.
I mean, it is awfully convenient, isn't it?
Very convenient. They essentially wrote a theory where their own generation gets to be the grand moral arbiters of history. But the casting director doesn't stop there. The second role assigned is the Nomad, originally categorized as a reactive type. This is Generation X.
The Nomads are born during an awakening. This is a time of immense spiritual upheaval when society is fiercely attacking its institutions and focusing entirely on adult self-actualization.
The summer phase.
Right. Consequently, the children born during this period, Generation X, become what the theory terms the expendable children. They grow up in an era defined by neglected childhoods. Think of the societal trends of the 1970s, skyrocketing divorce rates, dual-income households leaving kids to their own devices, the phenomenon of the latchkey kid.
The authors are incredibly explicit about how hostile the awakening era is to children. The sources bring up a brilliant cultural metaphor they use. They point to the 1968 horror film Rosemary's Baby.
That is such a dark comparison.
It really is. Strauss and Howe used that film as a literal metaphor for how Boomer-era, awakening America regarded its own children as a burden, an afterthought, or even something vaguely threatening to adult autonomy.
Because of this deeply neglected upbringing, nomads come of age during an unraveling. They emerge as highly pragmatic, deeply alienated, risk-taking survivors. They do not trust institutions because institutions were never there for them.
And their historical job within the cycle is crucial, right?
It is. When the inevitable crisis, the winter, finally hits, the nomads are in midlife.
Yeah.
They are not the moral visionary leaders. That is the role of the elder prophets. Instead, the nomads are the pragmatic managers. They are the tough, cynical survivors who have to get their hands dirty and pick up the pieces of the broken society.
Historically, who do Strauss and Howe compare them to?
They compare Generation X to the Lost Generation, the cohort of Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who survived the horrors of World War I and the excesses of the Roaring Twenties, with a similar sense of world-weary pragmatism and alienation.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the third archetype, the heroes, originally known as the civics. This is the millennial generation, and historically the GI generation that fought World War II. They are born after an awakening during an unraveling, and they come of age precisely when the massive historical crisis hits.
The hero archetype is designed to be the absolute polar opposite of the nomad. Because society senses that a crisis is looming on the horizon, children born in this era are heavily protected. The pendulum swings completely away from the neglect of the awakening.
Right, think about the baby on board signs that appeared in the 1980s. The rise of helicopter parenting, the intense focus on standardized testing and scheduled playdates.
These children are raised to be team-oriented, relentlessly optimistic, and fiercely rule-following.
The theory posits that this overprotection isn't an accident, it's an evolutionary historical defense mechanism. Society is preparing its young for war, whether literal or metaphorical. When the crisis finally arrives, these heroes are supposed to march in disciplined formation.
They are expected to embrace collective duty, sacrifice their individuality, and physically build the massive new institutions that will carry society into the next high. In World War II, the GI generation stormed the beaches of Normandy and then came home to build the interstate highway system.
The theory predicted that millennials would perform a similar feat of collective, heroic institution building during the current crisis. They provide the raw muscle and the optimistic compliance, while the elderly prophets stand at the podium providing the moral vision.
And finally, we arrive at the fourth role in the sequence, the artists, originally termed the adaptives. This archetype encompasses Generation Z, whom Neil Howe refers to as the Homelanders, and historically the silent generation, the cohort sandwiched between the heroic GIs and the rebellious boomers.
Artists are born right in the dead of winter. They are born during a crisis. Society is entirely obsessively focused on survival and massive institutional rebuilding, so these children are overprotected to an almost extreme degree. The trauma of the crisis makes adults deeply risk-averse regarding their young.
Because they are born in the crucible of a crisis, they come of age during the subsequent high of the spring. This is a period of immense societal conformity and institutional power.
As a result, artist generations grow up to be highly process-oriented, pluralistic, and deeply conformist themselves.
They're adept at navigating complex systems, but they often struggle profoundly with their own sense of independent identity. They are essentially a bridge generation. They are the empathetic facilitators and the technocrats who refine and humanize the new order built by the heroes, but they rarely lead with the same fiery, uncompromising passion as the prophets.
Think of the silent generation in the 1950s, the era of the man in the gray flannel suit. A generation characterized by caution, early marriage, and a desire to fit smoothly into the newly built corporate America.
So we have the complete cycle: prophets, nomads, heroes, and artists. It is incredibly neat.
It is a perfectly structured, tightly woven four-act play. But let's take a step back and look at who actually wrote this script. Who came up with this perfectly packaged, highly dramatic narrative? Because the backgrounds of the creators are highly revealing, and frankly, they explain a lot about why the theory looks the way it does. Let's start with William Strauss.
William Strauss was a lawyer by training, but more importantly, he was a highly successful political satirist. In 1981, he co-founded the Capitol Steps, which was a political comedy troupe made up of Senate staffers.
And this wasn't just a hobby, it grew into a multi-million-dollar entertainment company. They recorded 29 albums and performed in theaters nationwide.
Neil Howe, on the other hand, was a Washington policy consultant who frequently worked with deficit-hawk billionaires and think tanks.
When you look closely at those backgrounds, they explain the very DNA of generational theory. A comedy writer and political satirist like William Strauss possesses a very specific, highly refined skill set. The ability to observe incredibly complex, nuanced human behaviors and boil them down into memorable, flat caricatures that a mass audience can instantly recognize, consume, and laugh at.
Satire requires stereotypes to function. When you examine the rhetoric of the generational theory, the catchy seasonal metaphors, the memorable mythic labels like prophet and hero, the high narrative drama of a looming apocalyptic crisis, these are the tools of mass audience entertainment.
They are not the cautious, heavily caveated tools of rigorous academic sociology. It is brilliant marketing. As an article in Jacobin magazine profiled them, Strauss was described as a congressional staffer turned down market Weird Al, and Howe was a creature of DC think tanks.
That specific partnership produced a framework that reads like a gripping historical novel and sells like high-end corporate consulting, all wrapped securely in the authoritative, pseudo-scientific language of policy analysis. It is designed to be digestible, not academically rigorous.
Okay, let's unpack this, because every great theory, no matter how beautifully written or commercially successful, lives or dies on its evidence, on its data. And the source material we are diving into provides some absolutely fascinating stories about how this framework was actually built, and where the floorboards completely cave in under any real scrutiny. Let's start with what the sources call the Fairfax County problem, which exposes a fatal data flaw right at the foundation of the theory.
To understand the magnitude of the Fairfax County problem, we have to look specifically at how Strauss and Howe constructed the profile of the millennial generation. Remember, the theory absolutely required millennials to be the next hero archetype. They had to fit the script.
They were predicted to be rule-following, team-oriented, relentlessly optimistic, and deeply trusting of large institutions, just like the GI generation before them.
In 2009, the Chronicle of Higher Education, a major publication in the academic world, published a devastating expose on the methodology behind this millennial profile. It turned out that the core empirical data Strauss and Howe used to define the attitudes of this entire generation of roughly 80 million people was shockingly narrow.
How narrow are we talking?
It was heavily based on surveys of roughly 600 high school seniors from Fairfax County, Virginia.
And for you listening, we need to provide some crucial context about Fairfax County. Fairfax County in the late 1990s and early 2000s was not just any average American county. It was, and still is, one of the absolute wealthiest, most affluent suburban counties in the entire United States.
It's situated right outside Washington, D.C.
It is home to massive defense contractors. It was the headquarters of AOL during the dot-com boom, and it is populated by highly educated, high-earning professionals. The median household income is astronomical compared to the national average, so they took a tiny sample of rich, predominantly white, heavily sheltered, affluent suburban teenagers in the late 1990s and extrapolated a peer personality for 80 million incredibly diverse Americans across every socioeconomic strata.
It is a textbook, almost parodic example of catastrophic sampling bias. The researchers mistook the incredibly specific environment of elite suburban Virginia for a universal generational trait.
The resulting portrait accurately described affluent teenagers in the late 90s whose parents were thriving in a booming economy, but it did not describe the generation as a whole.
As the Chronicle noted, the rest of the profile was built on a hodgepodge of anecdotes, cherry-picked statistics, and pop culture references. College admissions professionals at the time were already raising alarms, pointing out that the Strauss and Howe millennial traits simply did not match the realities of poorer, working-class, or non-white students.
But this fundamentally flawed, Fairfax-centric profile became the absolute foundation for their massive corporate consulting engagements. They sold this portrait of optimistic, team-playing youths to Fortune 500 companies as the definitive guide to understanding millennial values.
It's just absurd when you really pause to think about it. You are taking the behavioral patterns of affluent teenagers who haven't even encountered the real economic world yet, who haven't paid a mortgage or dealt with a massive recession, and you are branding an entire 20-year span of humanity with those specific traits.
And what's wild is that if you dig deep enough, the authors actually seem to know they were building caricatures. There is a story buried deep in the source material about a hidden admission. If you go to the fine print all the way back in Appendix A of their original 1991 book, Generations, the authors admit something massive. It's almost a legal disclaimer. I will read the exact quote. The authors admit the peer personality is essentially a caricature of its prototypical member that individuals may resemble somewhat or almost not at all.
That is perhaps the most intellectually honest sentence in the entire 32-year body of work. Yet it completely undermines the premise of their lucrative consulting business.
By explicitly admitting that the archetypes are mere caricatures, the actual individuals may not resemble almost not at all, they have constructed an unfalsifiable escape hatch.
This is what the philosopher Karl Popper would call pseudoscience. If you point out a millennial who is deeply pessimistic, fiercely individualistic, and profoundly distrustful of institutions, which directly contradicts every aspect of the hero archetype, the theory isn't wrong.
That person is simply dismissed as an individual variation or an outlier.
Exactly. A theory that explains away every single counterexample as mere individual variants cannot be scientifically tested. It predicts nothing specific enough to ever be proven false. It is hermetically sealed against reality.
Which perfectly leads into the third major critique in the sources, which is the academic community's direct comparison of this theory to astrology. The academic critics do not hold back. They are merciless. You have a quote in the sources from Richard Gunderman, a prominent scholar, who states plainly that generationism holds, much like astrology, that persons can be prejudged according to their birth cohort.
The comparison to astrology is not just a rhetorical insult, it is a profound structural critique. Let's think about how astrology functions. It assigns you a fixed set of personality traits based on the exact timing of your birth relative to the stars. It accommodates any counterexamples or contradictory behaviors by invoking other influences in your chart, saying your moon sign or your rising sign is interfering, making it utterly impossible to disprove.
It relies on the Barnum effect, providing descriptions broad enough that anyone can find a piece of themselves in it.
Strauss and Howe's generational theory does the exact same structural maneuver, simply replacing the alignment of the stars with the alignment of historical seasons. Siva Vaidhanathan, a cultural historian from the University of Virginia, went even further in his critique, calling generational thinking just a benign form of bigotry.
Wow, a benign form of bigotry. That's a heavy accusation.
It is, but he makes a strong point. It relies on fundamentally prejudging people, assuming you know their deepest values, their work ethic, and their political worldview purely based on the year they were born, completely erasing their individual lived experience and their personal agency.
So why does this matter today? Why are we doing a deep dive on this right now? Let's bring this right into 2026, into the modern world you are navigating every single day. Why should you, the listener, care that two guys in the 1990s wrote a book comparing history to seasons and extrapolating data from rich teenagers?
You should care deeply because this unscientific theory spawned a massive, deeply entrenched corporate industry that actively impacts your livelihood, your workplace, and how you are perceived by the economy. We are talking about the corporate astrology industry.
The generational consulting industry was estimated to be worth roughly $70 million annually as of 2015, and Strauss and Howe were at the absolute forefront of inventing and monetizing it.
Their firm, originally called Life Course Associates and now known as Howe Generational Consulting, sells these exact 4 archetypes to an incredible, staggering roster of elite clients. We are talking about major global brands like Nike, Ford, Disney, Fidelity Investments.
But it goes beyond marketing. They consult for the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps. They reportedly charge between $30,000 and $50,000 just for a single keynote speech to tell executives how these archetypes behave.
Let's break this down into real-world consequences for you, the listener. When your HR department at work rolls out a mandatory new training module on how to manage Gen Z, or when a marketing team sits in a boardroom and decides to pivot their entire multi-million-dollar strategy to target what they believe are millennial values, they are often paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for expensive corporate astrology.
They are actively using frameworks that the National Academies of Sciences have explicitly said are not supported by empirical research. You are being managed at your job, you are being marketed to, and you are being evaluated based on historical caricatures.
And we can see how fundamentally flawed these caricatures are when we look at the monumental real-world failure of the hero archetype prediction for millennials.
According to the rigid 80-year secular cycle and the strict 4-archetype sequence, millennials were absolutely unavoidably destined to be the next GI generation. Strauss and Howe confidently predicted in the 1990s that as millennials came of age during the looming crisis, they would emerge as optimistic, institution-building heroes.
They predicted this generation would enthusiastically embrace martial duty, collective sacrifice, and physically build the infrastructure for the new societal high.
But let's look out the window at millennials today. Did they become the optimistic, institution-trusting Power Rangers the theory predicted? Not even close.
The reality is starkly, tragically different. Millennials have become the most economically precarious generation since the Great Depression.
They are burdened by crushing unprecedented levels of student debt. they have been completely locked out of the housing market in many major areas due to skyrocketing costs and stagnant wages. They came of age during the 2008 financial collapse and then were hit again by the economic shock of a global pandemic.
Yeah, they are deeply politically fractured and highly cynical about the institutions that have repeatedly failed them. The brutal reality of their economic situation completely destroyed the optimistic hero narrative. They aren't building the new interstate highway system. They are driving for Uber to make rent.
And this massive predictive failure is where the unfalsifiability of the theory really shows its true colors. Because the theory is designed so it cannot fail, the authors cannot simply admit the prediction was wrong. They cannot say, we misjudged the economic forces.
In their highly influential 1997 book, The Fourth Turning, they explicitly predicted the crisis would climax and resolve sometime before the year 2025. But as 2025 steadily approached and millennials were clearly not acting like the unified, triumphant GI generation, Neil Howe had a problem.
So he published his 2023 solo book, The Fourth Turning is Here. In it, rather than admitting the timeline failed or the archetype was wrong, he simply extended the runway. He quietly shifted the predicted resolution of the crisis from before 2025 to the mid-2030s.
A full decade, just a casual, decade-long goalpost shift, barely acknowledged as a massive failure of the original model.
So what does this all mean for you? It means you need to remember this fundamental truth. We are being managed, we are being marketed to, and we are being heavily stereotyped based on caricatures invented by consultants for mass consumption and entertainment, not by scientists gathering empirical data.
That brings us to a critical, foundational limitation of the theory, what sociologists formally refer to as the ecological fallacy. This is the massive blind spot of generational theory that the source text warns us about rigorously.
The ecological fallacy occurs when you make assumptions or inferences about specific individuals based entirely on aggregate data for a massive group. Strauss and Howe's theory fundamentally requires that your birth year is the absolute primary determinant of your collective identity.
It demands that birth year overrides race, it overrides economic class, it overrides gender, geography, and religion. It assumes the year you were born is the most important thing about you.
Let's give a highly concrete historical example from the text to really show how analytically absurd this is. The theory demands that a Black American born in 1945 in the deeply segregated rural Jim Crow south of Mississippi and a wealthy white American born the exact same year in an affluent, pristine suburb of Connecticut supposedly share a fundamental generational peer personality.
Think about the reality of 1945. Think about the wildly different worlds those two individuals grew up in. The theory claims that their shared birth year creates a psychological bond and a worldview that is stronger than their vastly, incomprehensibly different lived experiences.
It is mind-boggling when you say it out loud. It completely ignores the reality of systemic power, wealth, and racial discrimination.
It is analytically blind. When you group millions of vastly different people by birth year and attribute shared psychological traits to them, you are not doing sociology, you are producing stereotypes. This is exactly why the 2020 findings from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which we detailed earlier, are so definitive. Their conclusion was uncompromising. Categorizing workers with generational labels is not supported by research.
Furthermore, multiple independent studies published in rigorous journals like the Journal of Business Psychology have found little to no empirical evidence that generations even exist as distinct, measurable psychological groups. The differences within a supposed generation are always vastly larger than the differences between generations.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when a theory completely erases all systemic inequalities, when it deliberately ignores race, ignores class struggles, ignores the profound reality of how different people experience the exact same historical events just to keep its neat four-season narrative intact, it stops being a useful sociological tool.
It actually becomes a tool for erasing marginalized experiences.
Yes, it flattens the rich, complex, and often painful human experience into a slick, easily digestible consultant's PowerPoint slide.
But this raises an important question, though, and it's one we need to debate honestly right now. Because despite all these fatal flaws, despite the pseudoscience and the Fairfax County data bias, the theory has resonated with millions of people for over 30 years. Is there any utility to it at all?
It's a vital debate. Let's explore the defense.
Right, let's play devil's advocate here, because even if the rigid 80-year secular cycle is historical fiction, and even if the four exact archetypes are flawed, overly broad caricatures, the underlying concept of a generational diagonal, the idea of tracing cohorts of people through time as they age, is actually real, accepted sociology.
The renowned sociologist Karl Mannheim wrote a famous essay about this way back in 1923 called The Problem of Generations. He argued that shared historical events during youth do shape the cohorts that live through them.
Take the Gen X Nomad portrait, for example. The idea of being latchkey kids born during a specific period of rising divorce rates and institutional neglect in the 1970s that intuitively resonates with millions of Gen Xers. It feels true to their lived experience.
So doesn't the framework have value as a conversational heuristic? Doesn't it give us a shared, accessible vocabulary to talk about how historical eras shape human development?
It is a very fair point. The generational diagonal, which is the practice of reading data by birth cohort rather than just by static age brackets, is indeed a legitimate analytical technique used by real demographers. And yes, having a shared cultural vocabulary can facilitate broad conversations about shifting cultural values and historical trends.
But there is a massive catch.
There is. The counter-argument and the stance of the 150 demographers who signed that open letter is about the ultimate cost of that vocabulary. Is the social utility of having a neat conversational shorthand around the water cooler worth the immense cost of deterministic stereotyping? Does the intellectual comfort of a neat, four-act narrative justify Fortune 500 companies spending millions of dollars on pseudo-scientific frameworks that actively stereotype and mismanage their employees?
When you use a flawed heuristic to make hiring decisions, dictate management policies, or drive national political forecasts, the vague conversational value is vastly outweighed by the practical, tangible harm.
That is the genuine, complex question we want to invite you, the listener, to wrestle with today as you go about your week. Can we thoughtfully acknowledge that the specific era we grow up in deeply shapes who we are and what challenges we face without surrendering our individual agency to a corporate horoscope? Do we have to accept the rigid artificial box just to understand the flow of history?
It requires a level of cognitive nuance. It requires holding two seemingly contradictory ideas in your mind at once. Acknowledging that cohorts experience historical events differently based on their age at the time, while simultaneously rejecting the deterministic labels that try to predict an individual's personality or work ethic based on those cohort boundaries.
Exactly. And that leads us directly to our takeaway. We want to give you a highly practical, concrete action step for Monday morning. The next time you're sitting in a strategy meeting or reading a clickbait news article or just talking to a colleague by the coffee machine and someone makes a sweeping, definitive claim like Gen Z wants this specific thing in the workplace or boomers always vote exactly like that, I want you to pause. Just pause and ask yourself a very simple, incredibly powerful question. Which Gen Zers? Which boomers? Apply the profound lesson of the 600 kids from Fairfax County. Strip away the broad, consultant-driven generational label and try replacing it in your mind with more precise, meaningful demographic markers like economic class, current life stage, or geography. Ask yourself if the behavior being described is genuinely a permanent, fixed generational archetype, or if it is simply the natural, highly predictable result of a 24-year-old trying to navigate their first entry-level job in a punishing economy, or a 65-year-old trying desperately to protect their retirement fund during a period of high inflation.
Often, what we casually call a generational trait is just a universal life stage reality dressed up in expensive marketing buzzwords.
I love that. Replace the label with the life stage and see if the sentence still makes sense. It completely changes how you consume information and how you view the people around you.
And I will leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as we wrap up. Strauss and Howe built a massive, lucrative empire by telling us that history is a predetermined, unyielding script, one that forces us into the inescapable roles of prophets, nomads, heroes, or artists, based entirely on the ticking of a cosmic clock we cannot control. But if we reject that determinism, if we stop looking at history as a script that writes our lines for us before we are even born, what role would you actually choose to write for yourself right now in this moment of history?
That was lesson 3 of 14 on The Fourth Turning, Generational Theory Across 3 Decades. Subscribe for the full series. If you haven't seen our debate overview of the whole book, check that out, link in the description. Thanks for being here. See you next time.